So last week we talked about Abraham, and this week we're going to be talking about his son, Isaac. So tonight's message is titled, I Am Isaac. And what I want us to see here as we start off is that last week we talked about Abraham, and his legacy was actually what his faith was based off of. That his legacy was based on his faith in the promises of God. And so tonight what we're going to see is that actually the Lord provided for Isaac everything that he needed, and get this, at the perfect time. And that's going to be a really important thing for us to understand tonight, okay? What I want you to understand is, I say the perfect time because sometimes we want God to answer promises in the time that feels right for us. But the reality is sometimes God answers promises that don't necessarily take place in our time frame. It might be outside of that. And so what we're going to see through Isaac is that God provided for Isaac in the exact moments that he needed God to answer them. And so we're going to jump in. We're going to look at Genesis. Technically, Isaac is talked about between Genesis 21 through chapter 27. But tonight we're going to be focusing in more on Genesis 24, 25, and 26. We're not going to read through all of that, but I'm going to touch on major points from there. And so tonight, what I want you to first write down is that God actually provided an incredible wife for Isaac in a supernatural way. Okay? This is the start of where we're going to begin. God provided an incredible wife for Isaac in a supernatural way. And so what we're doing is we're entering into chapter 24 with Abraham, Isaac's father, getting closer to the end of his life. And his desire for his son Isaac is that ultimately he would marry someone that's an Israelite. And so we pick up in verse 3 by Abraham saying this to his slave or his servant. He says, "Swear by the Lord, the God of heaven and earth, that you will not allow my son to marry one of these local Canaanite women. Go instead to the homeland, to my relatives, and find a wife there for my son Isaac." Now, first, I want you to understand, in our context in the 21st century, this isn't a racist comment that Abraham's making here. But he's basically just knowing in his mind, as he looks at the people around him that they are living with, the Canaanite people weren't living for God. They didn't have a desire to follow after God. And so Abraham, knowing the desires that God has for not only Abraham, but also for his family, is that he wants Isaac to walk in step with the Lord. And these local Canaanite women would not be helping spur him on or get him motivated to want to live more for Christ. And so here, Abraham is starting to say to this servant, I want you to go find a bride for me in my homeland, where my people are that love God. And so the servant heads off with this calling to find this bride. And it's in a distant land where Abraham's relatives are. And so what I'm going to do is we're going to jump ahead now to verse 12, and we pick up on him finally starting to arrive into this homeland of Abraham. And he starts to make this statement to God, this prayer to God. He says, "O Lord, God of my father, Abraham," he prayed, "please give me success today and show me unfailing love to my master Abraham. See, I am standing here beside this spring, and the young women of the town are coming out to draw water. This is my request, and I'll ask of them, please give me a drink from your jug. If she says, yes, have a drink, and I'll water your camels too, let her be the one that you've selected as Isaac's wife. And this is how I will know that you have shown unfailing love to my master." And get this, in verse 15, before he had finished praying, he saw a young woman named Rebekah coming out with her water jug on her shoulder. See, here in verse 12, we pick up with the servant arriving in the land. And he does something here that's really humbling. And I don't want you to miss it tonight, because his first action when he gets here, some people would be on this mission and they would get to that location and then they would say, you know what, my first step is I need to go find females. That's pretty much my first objective. That's going to be how I find a wife. But yet, his first reaction here is that he pauses and he starts to seek the Lord first. And he offers the Lord a way in which he can be able to show him that this is truly the right woman for Isaac. And so he offers up a couple requests. He requests that, one, God would bring about a woman who would be able to say, hey, can I feed or give you water from this well? And then he takes it a step further and he says, that anybody could potentially say that, but I'm going to make the next step of saying not only will she ask me that, but then she's also going to say, hey, can I also water your camels too? Which I don't know if you guys know how much camels actually drink, but they drink a ton of water if they've not had water for a while. And so this would be a labor-intensive moment for this woman, bringing out all these buckets of water and feeding these camels. And so honestly, what it's showing is that she would have this humility to be able to serve this servant. And so this would be a cool way in which God would be able to fulfill his prayer. But I want you to highlight this or write it down in your notes. Before he had finished praying. Because what is really cool about this, and why it ties back into the fact that God is providing for Isaac everything that he needs at the exact moment that he needs it, is that before this servant finished praying, God was already answering the prayer. That Rebekah was starting to come. And he was answering his prayer before he had finished. And I want you to know this tonight. For you personally, when you read this, I want you to understand that God knows your deepest desires. He does. And before you speak them to God, he's already preparing ways in which he can answer them. Just like here, just like in this moment, God was already preparing the requests of this servant. Because God is able to look into the future and know what you need before you need it. And so in the same way, when you come before God, you can be able to pray knowing he already has heard your prayer long ago. And he's ready to answer it in his timing. And that's a powerful thing to be able to see in verse 15. But before we go on, what I want us to do is to jump to verse 23. And we see even this greater picture of God answering the servant's humble prayer. Because in verse 23, the servant goes, "Whose daughter are you?" he asked. "And tell me," also let me pause. In that moment, in between these two verses, Rebekah comes and asks, "Can I give you water?" And then she also follows up and says, "Can I feed your camels too?" And so she's doing exactly what the servant wanted to see as the way in which he would know that this is the wife for Isaac. And so he starts to dig a little deeper. And so he says, "Whose daughter are you? And please tell me, would your father have any room to put us up for the night?" And she responds and says, "I am the daughter of Bethuel." She replied, "My grandparents are Nahor and Milcah. Yes, we have plenty of straw and feed for camels, and we have room for guests." And the man bowed low and worshiped the Lord. "Praise the Lord, the God of my master Abraham," he said. "The Lord has shown unfailing love and faithfulness to my master, for he has led me straight to my master's relatives." See, in this moment, on first glance, Rebekah's family line doesn't sound that important. Like, she could have just said those and it would have been like, okay, that's kind of cool, but it really didn't carry much meaning. But to this servant, when he heard the family line that she was coming from, it was extremely important for him. It was a supernatural way of God answering his prayer. Rebekah was a distant relative of Abraham. And God brought the first woman to that well, to that servant, and she was the exact person that was meant for Isaac. But the servant's second action is also important for us to note. When he realizes that she is the descendant of Abraham, what does he do? He turns and he worships God. He goes and he understands that God was doing a supernatural work here, and so he responds in an amazing, humbling, worshipful way. And when God answers our prayers, moments where we are coming before God and saying, "God, this is what I desire for you to do," and he shows up and does those things, our response should be the exact same way, humble worship before God. praising him for the things that he's done, and also praising him for the things he's going to continue to do in your life. And so here in this moment, the servant understands that God is picking Rebekah. But there's a few steps he needs to go through. He kind of needs to meet the family. And so we pick up in verse 50. Him starting to enter back into the house. He's explaining to basically Rebekah's family all that has happened. That he was sent from Abraham to go find Isaac as a wife. And then when he shows up, he has these prayers. And then there's Rebekah. She shows up and answers those prayers. And he goes through all of these things, laying out all the ways that God was working in this moment. And then in verse 50, her family responds. It says, "Then Laban and Bethuel replied, 'The Lord has obviously brought you here, so there's nothing we can say. Here is Rebekah. Take her and go. Yes, let her be the wife of your master's son, as the Lord has directed.'" So see here, in this moment, we start to see Laban, her brother, and then also Bethuel, her father, which was a nephew of Abraham. And both of them hear the story that this servant is saying, and they start to realize something, that God is at work. He's doing an amazing work in this whole situation. And so they give in this moment their blessing for Rebekah to go back to this homeland. But I'm going to be honest about something. If I was the father of Rebekah and a guy shows up in this moment and says, "Here's all these things that have happened, and I want to take your daughter back to this distant land, and I want to give her as a bride to this man," my mind would not be automatically probably going, "Oh yeah, for sure, you just go take her and send her off to this distant land," right? No, in that moment, I probably would have been like, "Okay, let's talk about this a little bit more. This seems a little rushed." But in this moment, God is doing a supernatural work. He's working in the hearts of these two men. He's working in the heart of Rebekah. He's working in the situation with the servant. And all of these things are coming together in a perfect way where they are able to go, "You know what? We see that God is doing an incredible thing here." And so 9 verses later, Rebekah's given a blessing before she departs. And we pick up in verse 60 and we see them say, "Our sister, may you become the mother of many millions. May your descendants be strong and conquer the cities of their enemies." And you know what's amazing about that statement that they say right there? Is that if you were here last week, that same statement was made to Sarai, that she would be a mother of multitudes, and that God would do an amazing work through their family lines, through their descendants. And God is continuing that promise, not just for Sarai, Abraham's wife, but he's doing it now through the soon-to-be Isaac's wife. She would carry on those promises, and so they depart. But the story, honestly, in this moment, what I love about it is it gets a little bit like a fairy tale princess story, okay? What do I mean by that? Because in verse 62, it continues and it says, "Meanwhile, Isaac, whose home was in the Negev, had returned from Beer-lahai-roi, and one evening as he was walking, meditating in the fields, he looked up and he saw the camels coming. When Rebekah looked up and saw Isaac, she quickly dismounted from her camel. 'Who is that man walking through the fields to meet us?' she asked the servant. And he replied, 'It is my master.' And so Rebekah covered her face with her veil, and then the servant told Isaac everything he had done. And Isaac brought Rebekah into his mother Sarai's tent, and she became his wife. He loved her deeply, and she was special comfort to him after the death of his mother." See, in verse 62, what we start to see lay out is that Rebekah has almost arrived to the land that Isaac's in. And the things just start becoming romantically interesting here because Rebekah is still a long ways out, and she sees Isaac. And then the next step is that she starts to ask these questions of like, who is that person? And she realizes in that moment that this is the one that she's going to marry. And so she covers her face, signifying that she's this bride to be. And so Isaac then sees her and comes out to them and meets them. And the servant tells him all that's happened, the ways that God has worked. And so Isaac takes her into his family, and he loves her deeply. He cares for her well. And in this moment, not that long ago, he lost his mother, and so this was like a special comfort to him in that time to have someone that he can love so well. And so God was providing in this beautiful story between Rebekah and Isaac, and yet he's doing it in a supernatural way that was provided at the exact time that it needed to be done. There's the servant going to the distant land. There's this woman, first woman, that comes to the servant. There's Rebekah being willing to go. There's Laban and Bethuel allowing her to go. And so God is doing the supernatural work. And even with the supernatural ways that God provided Isaac with this bride, God's not done with Isaac's story. Because this is where we jump into chapter 25. And we see that God, and you can write this down, God provided Isaac with twins when children seemed impossible. Because see, there's a dilemma when we step into Genesis 25, verse 19. There's a dilemma that's taking place. Because Isaac's wife, Rebekah, is having issues with having children. And again, if you don't remember from last week, we talked about children are what carry the family line on. And in the same way today, like if you don't have a child, especially a son that's going to carry, like for me, the Wurzel name on, then my family line would end. But in that time, it was even that much more important that the family line would continue. And so for them, their family line looked like it was coming to a conclusion because they weren't able to have kids. But then we jump into verse 21 here. And it says, Isaac pleaded with the Lord on behalf of his wife because she was unable to have children. And the Lord answered Isaac's prayer, and Rebekah became pregnant with not just one, but twins. See, Isaac in this moment has a deep concern for his wife. He has turmoil in his heart for his wife. He wants her to be able to have children. And he doesn't turn to other things in order to grow his family, which is very different than Abraham. If you guys remember, if you were here last week, we saw that in Abraham's story, when things like this, where they weren't able to have children, were happening, they short-circuited God's plan, and they went and had him have a child with their servant in order to carry the family line on. And God said, that's not how I'm carrying on this promise for you. And yet here in this moment, we see Abraham's son in a same dilemma where they aren't able to carry on the family line. And yet they remain faithful to God's promises, and they come before God as their first source. That they turn to him and they go, God, this is what's happening. Do you see it? This is what we desire. And God sees and he notices it in this moment, and he provides for them. And so some time passes from here, roughly 9 months. And we pick up in verse 24. And it says, and when the time came to give birth, Rebekah discovered that she didn't indeed have twins. Again, they don't have ultrasounds to be able to check like we do today. So they had twins, and the first one was a little different. He was very red at birth, and he was covered with thick hair like a fur coat. And so they named him Esau. And when the other twin was born, with his hand grasping Esau's heel, so they named him Jacob. And Isaac was 60 years old when the twins were born. So here in this moment, we see two twins born for them, and God providing in an incredible way for them to be able to have children. Now, we're going to cover a little bit next week more of this story because we're going to start digging into Jacob's life and what he experienced. But what you need to understand is that these two people here introduced are Esau and Jacob. And there's much to come in both of their stories, both good and also bad. Ways that they loved each other and ways they didn't love each other so well. And while this seems like this is just a short section here, talking through her like having these kids, this is a moment in time where God is showing up in a powerful way. This is a moment where Isaac's line is now carried on, but more importantly than that, this is a moment where God's promise has not ended. That the promise that he set for Abraham and Sarah is continuing on for Isaac and Rebekah. God has not forgotten what he said. And he's answering it in this moment when they thought that, you know what, it's not going to carry on beyond us. And for them, they were able to see God show up in an amazing way through prayer at the exact time that they needed it. But even when it seems like this happily ever after story for Isaac and Rebekah, God provides even a more perfect moment for them. And this is where we start to see in chapter 26 that God actually provided Isaac with peace, and he provided with them with security where conflict had been. And so what I want us to do is to unpack verse 12 here, because what it starts off with is, it says, when Isaac planted his crops that year, he harvested 100 times more grain than he planted, for the Lord blessed him, and he became a very rich man, and his wealth continued to grow. He acquired so many flocks of sheep and goats, herds of cattle and servants, that the Philistines became jealous of him. And so the Philistines filled up all of Isaac's wells with dirt. These were the wells that had been dug by the servants of his father Abraham. And finally, Abimelech ordered Isaac to leave the country. Go somewhere else, he said, for you have become too powerful for us. See, God continues in this section of Genesis with showing Isaac that he provided for him in the ways that he needed to be provided for in the past. But then God also shows that he's providing for him still in this moment, a moment where there is some tension between different groups. And so God starts showing him, one, I'm going to produce more than you need for food. 100 times more than what they originally planted. So he has more than enough in his crops, but then it also starts to cause him to become rich. God's providing with him in a material way. And his wealth continued to grow, not just plateau. And he's got many sheep. He's got a lot of goats. He's got herds of cattle. And he's got all of these different servants to be able to help with all of these different things that he's now been given by God. However, there's a problem here in this moment with all that the Lord has done for Isaac. The Philistines aren't pleased with what's going on. The people in that land, because they look and they see Isaac having all of these great things happening for him, but they start to become jealous of all of it. And so they're frustrated with what's happening, and so they decided, you know what, let's go tear down all of his different wells. Now, if you don't understand, that doesn't help with your crops to not have water. It doesn't help very well when you can't feed all of your different livestock. And so they shut all of these wells up, and they're like, okay, this will do it. And so Abimelech, their leader, ordered Isaac away from them and said, you can't live here any longer. You've grown too good for us, too big for us, and we don't want you. And yet, God is still in control of this situation, even when it looked rough for Isaac. But then God shows up in a really cool way in verse 23. Because it says, from there, Isaac moved to Beersheba, where the Lord appeared to him on the night of his arrival. I am the God of your father, Abraham, he said. Do not be afraid, for I am with you and will bless you, and I will multiply your descendants, and they will become a great nation. I will do this because of my promise to Abraham, my servant. And then Isaac built an altar there, and he worshiped the Lord. He set up his camp at that place, and his servants dug another well. See, in this moment, God has not forgotten Isaac, even in his wandering. And what I want you to understand tonight is that no matter where you are in your own life story, God has not forgotten you. That God is having you maybe walk through moments of wandering or hard times, but he has not forgotten you there. He has a plan and a purpose for you, no matter what situation you go through, whether it's good, whether it's bad. God offers again the same promise here to Isaac as he did to Abraham. He gives him a multiplication of his family line, saying that you will have your family line continued. And then he says, you're going to be this great nation that people will look and see. And because of this great promise here, Isaac offers, just like the servant, his humble worship before God. And he understands that God is doing an amazing work in his life, and he responds in worship. And he resets his well that was torn down by the Philistines and digs this new one and starts to continue his family. You know, tonight as I was reading through that, it made me think, how might we respond to God when he offers us promises? What is our response when we read through Scripture and God says, you know what, I am with you no matter what you walk through. I'm your shepherd. I'm your guardian. I'm your protector. How do we respond to God? Because for Isaac, he sees promises that God lays out for him, and his response is worship. But my call for you guys tonight is that you would respond in the same way, that you would read through all of these different promises that God is offering you, and that you would respond and go, God, I praise you for what you've done, what you've said, and now I want to live my life in such a way that shows that I am excited of how you are caring for me. How might we respond with God when he offers promises to us? And do we respond in worship? Because the reality is here, Isaac responds in worship, and God follows up his response in protection in verse 26. Because it says, then one day, okay, remember, King Abimelech from the Philistines came from Gerar with his advisor Azulith, and also Pichol, and his army commander. Why have you come here? Isaac asked. You obviously hate me since you kicked me off your land. And they replied, we can plainly see that the Lord is with you. And so we want to enter into a sworn treaty with you. Let's make a covenant. Swear that you will not harm us, just as we've never troubled you. We've always treated you well, and we sent you away from us in peace. And now look how the Lord has blessed you. I just want you to understand some irony here, okay? Because this is a really sneaky request on Abimelech's part. Because he says here, we've never troubled you, Isaac. What did they do? They tore down all of his wells, put them all away, and said, you have to leave here. And so they're like, oh yeah, we've never troubled you. We've never treated you wrong. Oh, but except we made you go to a completely different land. Forgot about that. See, he's saying all of these things, and yet I'm sure in this moment, Isaac is listening to this going, what are you talking about? Have you forgotten what's happened already in the past? But Isaac in this moment, even though he knows the things that have happened for him, he agrees to a treaty. And right after this treaty is made, it's really cool because God shows up at the exact perfect time. Because one of Isaac's servants runs up to him, the Philistines have gone, and they say that there's water in the well that they've dug. That now water is coming, and it's going to provide water for their land. It's going to provide water for their cattle. It's going to provide water for his family. And God, in this moment, has provided once again at the perfect time that it needed to happen. God's lining up all these things for Isaac. And you know what's really cool is in my own story, what I've noticed is that when you come to a moment where you say yes to God, God shows up in cool ways. For Bree and I, honestly, I've shared a little bit of our story of coming here to Michigan, but there was a moment when we were in Chicago, and God said, you know what? He was opening all these doors to us to come here. It was hard for us in that moment because we had some other desires and things that we would have said, maybe, God, this is where we want to go. And God answered our prayers in a very different way than we expected. And yet the moment where Bree and I finally made the decision, we were like, you know what, God, we're going to go to Berrien Center and we're going to work there. I'm telling you, right after that happened, God lined up a house for us while we were still in college. A house that we shouldn't have gotten because somebody else gave a higher bid on. And yet the couple accepted our request. God opened up doors for me to get right involved into the community coaching. God opened up the door for Bree to start working in the coffee shop. God opened up doors for us in such amazing ways. And all it took was us to finally say, yes, God, I'm going to go where you call me to go. It wasn't easy. It didn't feel like the right moment for me of where I wanted to go. But yet God will provide for you in the exact ways that you need at the exact time that you need it. And I want you guys to hear that tonight. And so what I want to do is for our now what's, our takeaways for tonight. The first one is that obedience is the clear call of God when it comes to his provision. And I'll maybe even tag on to that, worship to God as well. When we see God working in incredible ways in our life, where he's answering prayers in our life, and he's showing us his direction that he's calling us to, our response is obedience to God and saying, you know what, God, I'm going to go where you are calling me to go. Because ultimately, the Lord provided for Isaac everything that he needed at the exact moment that he needed it. But I'm going to even take it the step further and say that you are going to be provided by God for everything that you need. That the Lord provides for you everything you need at the perfect time. It's hard sometimes to wait if it's not what you hope for. But yet God also knows the grand scheme of your entire life and what you need. So our obedience and trust in God is the key factor in all of that. So let's go ahead and let's pray. God, I thank you for tonight looking at Isaac's story and just seeing the ways in which you showed up. The fact that you provided him a wife at the exact perfect time. That you provided for him in giving him kids to carry on his family line. That you provided for him all of these different resources that he was able to use. You were able to provide protection for him. And God, what I ask is that these students wouldn't walk away from this message going, okay, that's a cool story for Isaac. But that they would see that you show up for those that you love. That you are there for them. That you provide what they need at the exact time that they need it. And so, God, I ask that that would give them confidence and boldness to step out in faith. And that they would be able to be individuals that look different than the culture. That they be individuals that are passionate about sharing you, sharing the love that you have for all. And so, God, I ask that you would help these students to continue on your rescue mission for people around them. And I pray this all in your Son's name, Jesus Christ. Amen.